He said he could end it in 24 hours. Now, he's promising to finish it for good. President Donald Trump is not just stepping back into the ring, he's declaring all-out political and strategic war on Russia, vowing to see this through to the absolute end. And with a high-stakes, closed-door meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky just days away, the world is holding its breath. This isn't just another diplomatic meeting, this is a potential declaration of a final chapter, a promise that could ignite the most volatile phase of this brutal conflict. What does the end for Russia actually look like? Is it a negotiated peace from a position of overwhelming strength, or is it the complete military and political capitulation of the Kremlin? And is the world ready for the explosive, unpredictable consequences that will follow? Strap in, because the rules of the game we've known for years are about to be shattered beyond recognition. The bombshell dropped not in a polished press conference, but in a characteristically blunt, off-the-cuff statement to a scrum of reporters. As he prepared to meet with the Ukrainian leader, President Trump laid it out in terms no one could possibly misunderstand. The war with Russia is now his undisputed top foreign policy priority. He didn't speak of cautious diplomacy, of drawn-out negotiations, or of ceasefires. He used the language of a finisher, of a man who believes the final bell is about to ring. We will see this through to the end. This is a seismic shift in tone and potentially in the entire machinery of American policy. The man who once boasted of his unique relationship with Putin, who often seemed to admire the Russian leader's strength, is now drawing a line in the sand and promising a conclusive victory. But what does the end actually entail? That's the multi-trillion-dollar question that has every world leader on edge. Is it a negotiated peace signed from a position of such overwhelming strength that Moscow has no choice but to accept Kyiv's terms? Or is it the complete military and political capitulation of the Russian regime, a scenario that risks pushing a cornered Putin to the brink? The deliberate ambiguity is what makes this statement so dangerously, electrifyingly provocative. This imminent meeting with Zelensky, scheduled for this very week, is now charged with an electricity the world hasn't felt since the early shocking days of the full-scale invasion. It's no longer just a photo op for solidarity, it's a war council of the highest order. Insiders from both capitals suggest the agenda is a direct, hard-nosed response to Trump's new mantra of finality. They will be discussing the transfer of the most advanced Western weaponry yet, systems that were previously considered strictly off-limits for fear of triggering an uncontrollable escalation. We're talking about F-16 fighter jets being fast-tracked out of training pipelines and into Ukrainian skies, not in months but in weeks. We're talking about unlocking the full range of the Army tactical missile systems, a capability that puts every single Russian command post in Ukraine and every military asset deep inside occupied Crimea, firmly and irrevocably in the crosshairs. This is the endgame toolkit being unlocked in real time, and the discussions in that room will determine how quickly it's delivered. And the man in the center of this gathering storm, Volodymyr Zelensky, is arriving with one singular mission: to arm this new fierce American resolve with everything he needs to make it a battlefield reality. His shopping list is a definitive blueprint for offensive victory, not just stalemate. He will be pushing relentlessly for the final, most consequential removal of all restrictions on using Western-supplied weapons to strike legitimate military targets inside Russian territory itself. This single policy change would fundamentally rewrite the geography of the war, finally allowing Ukraine to hit the airfields from which bombers take off to terrorize its cities, the bases where hundreds of Shahed drones are launched, and the massive supply depots and rail lines that fuel the entire frontline war machine. It would force Russia to defend its own soil for the first time in this conflict, stretching its air defenses and military resources to the absolute breaking point. For Zelensky, Trump's new uncompromising rhetoric is the political opening he has been waiting for after years of grinding attritional warfare. He is coming to convert words into weapons and a promise into a plan for liberation. But the shockwaves from Trump's stark statement hit far beyond the corridors of Washington and Kiev. In Moscow, the initial reaction was predictably furious, a mix of bluster and threats. But beneath the performative anger, there are almost certainly signs of deep, genuine concern, if not outright alarm. The Kremlin has meticulously built its long-term strategy on a war of economic and military attrition, betting that Western support would eventually wane, that political fatigue would set in, and that divisions would splinter the alliance. Trump's stark declaration of a final push, of seeing it through, shatters that core calculation. It presents Putin with a nightmare scenario he has long sought to avoid: an America fully, publicly, and unambiguously committed not just to Ukraine's survival, but to Russia's decisive and undeniable defeat. The question now is how the Kremlin will respond to this ultimate pressure. Will they double down, announcing a new wave of mass mobilization and threatening even more drastic escalatory measures, potentially involving chemical or tactical nuclear threats? Or will they, faced with the prospect of a fully armed Ukraine backed by an unshakable US, see the writing on the wall and desperately seek a face-saving exit before it's too late? One thing is certain: the stakes for Putin's regime have just been raised from strategic to truly existential. The game has changed, and he knows it. The implications of this hardened American stance are sending tectonic shocks through every layer of the global power structure, creating ripple effects that will be felt for generations. For the United States itself, this represents the most significant foreign policy gamble unsustainable since the Iraq War, potentially even since the Vietnam era. By openly declaring the strategic defeat of Russia as a primary national security objective, the US is effectively staking its global reputation, its military resources, and its economic stability on the outcome of a single conflict that has already defied all predictions. This isn't just about supporting an ally anymore, it's about fundamentally reshaping the entire world order by deliberately breaking one of its key historical players. The commitment means not just billions more in military aid, but potentially trillions in long-term reconstruction costs, unprecedented levels of intelligence sharing that risk exposing sensitive sources and methods, and accepting a dramatically higher risk of direct confrontation with a nuclear-armed state. The American public, which has shown clear signs of war fatigue and growing skepticism about the financial burden, must now psychologically prepare for a prolonged, expensive, and possibly much more violent phase of engagement that could easily spill over into other domains like cybersecurity and economic warfare. This decisive decision transforms the Ukraine conflict from a regional European security issue into the central front of America's broader strategic competition with authoritarian powers worldwide, effectively making Ukraine the proxy battlefield for a new Cold War that's rapidly turning hot. For the NATO alliance, Trump's stark declaration creates both a historic opportunity and an existential crisis that threatens the very foundation of the transatlantic partnership. The unambiguous promise to see this through to the end forces European members to confront uncomfortable questions they've deliberately avoided for 2 years. What exactly constitutes the end that everyone can agree on? Are all members psychologically and militarily prepared to support Ukraine until every single inch of its internationally recognized territory is liberated, including the historically contentious Crimean Peninsula? The coming weeks will reveal serious, potentially irreparable fractures between Eastern members like Poland and the Baltic states, who passionately advocate for maximum pressure to completely break Russian power, and Western members like Germany and France, who remain deeply concerned about the economic devastation and security consequences of pushing a nuclear-armed Putin into a corner with no escape route. Germany and France now face their ultimate moment of truth. Will they match American resolve with equivalent military and economic support, including sending their own advanced weapon systems they've so far withheld, or will they become the weak link that fractures alliance unity? The emergency NATO summit scheduled for next week will likely be the most contentious and emotionally charged in the organization's 75-year history, severely testing whether the alliance can maintain its famous unity when the stakes have been raised from supporting Ukrainian sovereignty to engineering the comprehensive defeat of a major world power. The global economic impact of this escalated commitment cannot be overstated, as it signals a potential permanent decoupling between Western economies and Russia that will rewrite international trade relationships. Trump's dramatic policy shift essentially buries any lingering hopes of eventually normalizing economic relations with Moscow, with profound consequences for global energy markets, worldwide food supplies, and the foundations of international finance. European nations that have quietly maintained some energy ties with Russia through third countries must now accelerate their already painful transition to alternative sources, likely causing renewed price volatility and supply disruptions. The systematic seizure and repurposing of frozen Russian sovereign assets to fund Ukraine's reconstruction and military needs will create legal and financial precedents that could reshape the principles of international monetary sovereignty for decades to come, potentially leading other nations to diversify away from dollar-based systems they now see as politically weaponized. Meanwhile, economic powerhouses like China and India face increasing, uncomfortable pressure to choose sides in a conflict that's rapidly evolving from a regional war into a definitive East-West confrontation that could split the global economy into competing blocs. The Chinese leadership in particular must carefully calculate whether their strategic partnership with Russia is worth the collateral damage to their delicate relations with Western markets at a time when their domestic economy already faces significant structural headwinds and requires stable international trade relationships to recover. On the actual battlefield, this political declaration from Washington translates into immediate and brutal tactical consequences that will determine the fate of thousands of soldiers. Russian military commanders, anticipating a new devastating wave of advanced Western weapons reaching Ukrainian front lines, are likely to intensify their current offensive operations dramatically, trying to seize as much territory as possible before these game-changing systems can be fully deployed, integrated, and utilized effectively by Ukrainian forces. We may see desperate, bloody attempts to create irreversible face accomplice on the ground, particularly in the contested Donbas region, where positional warfare has dragged on for months. Ukrainian commanders stationed along these sprawling front lines report that Russian troops are already digging in deeper, preparing more elaborate defensive positions and complex trench systems in clear anticipation of better equipped and more powerful Ukrainian counteroffensives coming in the near future. The coming months will likely see some of the war's most intense and brutal fighting, as both sides clearly recognize that the window for determining the conflict's ultimate outcome is narrowing rapidly with each new weapons shipment. The character of the war is visibly changing from a slow war of attrition to a desperate race against time, Russia racing to consolidate territorial gains before Western support becomes overwhelming, and Ukraine racing to stabilize destabilize vulnerable front lines until the new capabilities arrive that could finally turn the tide decisively in their favor. The human cost of this escalated commitment on all sides will be absolutely staggering, creating trauma that will haunt nations for decades. Ukrainian soldiers who have already endured years of relentless combat under horrific conditions must now psychologically prepare for what could realistically be the war's most intense and deadly chapter, testing the limits of human endurance. Civilian populations living in cities and villages near the volatile front lines face the terrible, heartbreaking reality that the path to eventual victory may require enduring even greater destruction and suffering first, as Russian forces lash out with everything they have. And inside Russia itself, another painful mobilization of hundreds of thousands of additional conscripts seems increasingly inevitable as the Kremlin attempts to offset Ukraine's growing qualitative advantage with sheer quantitative superiority, throwing young men into the meat grinder of modern warfare. This isn't just an abstract geopolitical shift discussed in diplomatic circles. It's a concrete decision that will directly determine how many mothers will mourn their sons, how many historic cities will be reduced to uninhabitable rubble, and how many future generations will bear the deep psychological scars of this devastating conflict. The solemn promise to see it through to the end carries with it the grim, unspoken understanding that the final chapters of this war may paradoxically be its bloodiest and most destructive, raising profound moral questions about the price of victory and the nature of peace that follows such devastation. The geopolitical ramifications extend far beyond the immediate theater of war, potentially creating a world that is more dangerous, more polarized, and more unstable than at any time since the Cold War's darkest days. Nations across Africa, Asia, and Latin America that have tried to maintain neutrality now face immense pressure to align with one of the competing blocs, risking their own economic stability and political autonomy. International institutions like the United Nations face irrelevance as great power consensus becomes impossible, undermining global governance on issues from climate change to nuclear proliferation. The arms industry is experiencing a historic boom, while diplomacy languishes as countries everywhere recalibrate their security strategies for a world where military might once again determines geopolitical outcomes. This decisive American commitment doesn't just aim to end a war, it accelerates the fragmentation of the international order into competing spheres of influence where rules-based systems are replaced by raw power politics. The world that emerges from this confrontation will look fundamentally different and more dangerous than the one that existed before Trump made his fateful declaration to pursue total victory at any cost. Let's talk about the weapons that could define this endgame, because we're moving far beyond the javelins and HIMARS that dominated earlier phases of this conflict. The discussion now happening in Washington and European capitals revolves around weapon systems that fundamentally change Ukraine's capacity to wage offensive warfare. We're talking about F-16 fighter jets, not as a symbolic gesture of support, but as a fully integrated part of Ukraine's air force, capable of establishing local air superiority over key sectors of the front and challenging Russia's dominance in the skies. It's about the ATACMS missile systems with cluster munitions that could decimate entire Russian battalion tactical groups in a single strike, destroying concentrations of armor and artillery that have proven so difficult to dislodge through conventional means. But the real game changer, the weapon system that undoubtedly keeps Kremlin generals awake at night, is the potential provision of longer-range army tactical missile systems variants that can strike deep into the Crimean Peninsula, targeting the very naval bases and airfields Russia considers its secure southern fortress and has used as launching pads for attacks across Ukraine. Giving Ukraine these sophisticated tools isn't just about helping them defend their land anymore, it's about giving them the capacity to systematically dismantle Russia's military logistics and command structure throughout the occupied territories, making it impossible for Moscow to sustain its war machine. This transforms Ukraine from a nation fighting for survival into a force capable of executing complex, large-scale offensive operations to take back its sovereign territory on its own terms. That is the tangible military meaning behind seeing it through to the end. It's the deliberate transition from resilient resistance to empowered liberation. But this accelerated path is mined with political and strategic explosives that could detonate with catastrophic consequences. The very notion of a US president, particularly one with Trump's history of challenging established international norms and institutions, steering this confrontation to its violent conclusion, has allies and adversaries alike scrambling to recalibrate their positions in real time. In European capitals like Berlin and Paris, there's a palpable tension between a sense of grim necessity and sheer terror at what might come next. They intellectually recognize that a decisive Ukrainian victory represents the only sustainable outcome for long-term European security, but the prospect of being dragged into the final, most violent chapter of this war by an unpredictable American partner who may not fully consider the continent's vulnerabilities represents their worst geopolitical nightmare come true. They fear a US policy driven primarily by the desire for a definitive win could recklessly disregard the nuanced realities of European energy security, economic stability, and the potentially catastrophic impact of a total Russian state collapse on their doorstep. The upcoming emergency NATO summit will be less a routine meeting of allies and more a high-stakes week's therapy session played out on the global stage, with some members pushing for full-throated support of Trump's endgame strategy, while others plead for caution, terrified of the inevitable blowback that would primarily strike European nations first and hardest. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the state propaganda machine is shifting into apocalyptic overdrive, preparing the population for what it frames as an existential struggle against the entire Western world. But behind the bluster and nuclear saber-rattling, the mood in the Kremlin's secure halls is likely grim and increasingly desperate. Putin's entire strategy was predicated on outlasting Western willpower, on waiting for political divisions and war fatigue to fracture the coalition supporting Ukraine. The emergence of a US administration fully committed to not just outlasting, but outright defeating Russia regardless of cost or duration fundamentally undermines his entire theory of victory and leaves him with increasingly unattractive options. A full national mobilization would be politically risky, potentially sparking domestic unrest and economically devastating for a country already straining under sanctions. The threat of nuclear escalation remains the ultimate card, but playing it would isolate Russia even from cautious partners like China and India, who have drawn clear red lines against such actions. This narrowing field leaves primarily asymmetric warfare options, a dramatic increase in sophisticated cyber attacks targeting Western critical infrastructure including power grids and financial systems, a global campaign of sabotage against undersea cables and supply chains, intensified assassination campaigns against defectors and opposition figures abroad, and redoubled efforts to destabilize Western democracies through sophisticated information operations aimed at undermining support for Ukraine. A cornered Putin represents the most dangerous version of this leader, and Trump's unambiguous declaration has effectively backed him into that corner with limited escape routes. The world must now collectively brace for the reaction of a wounded nuclear-armed bear that sees its survival at stake. For the long-suffering people of Ukraine, this dangerous new phase brings a torrent of conflicting emotions that tear at the national psyche. In the muddy, blood-soaked trenches of the Donbass, battle-hardened soldiers hear the news of Trump's commitment and the promise of advanced weapons with a sense of grim vindication mixed with sober realization of the fights to come. It fuels their resolve, offering the first clear vision of a plausible path to victory after years of bloody stalemate. But they understand better than anyone the price that will be paid in Ukrainian lives to reach that conclusion. They speak quietly among themselves, not just of holding the line, but of finally breaking it and pushing forward to reclaim what was stolen. But for civilians in cities like Kharkiv, Mykolaiv, and Odessa, living under the constant threat of glide bombs, missile barrages, and Iranian drones, the promise of an endgame is met with a deep, chilling anxiety that permeates daily life. They know from bitter experience that the final act of this war will likely be its most destructive and terrifying chapter. A cornered Russian military, facing the prospect of humiliating defeat, will not retreat quietly into the night. It will almost certainly lash out with overwhelming brutality against Ukrainian population centers, infrastructure, and cultural landmarks in a scorched earth campaign of vengeance. The very weapons that could bring liberation, the long-range missiles hitting Crimean airfields and Black Sea Fleet facilities, could simultaneously be the trigger for horrific retaliation on their apartment blocks, schools, and hospitals.